Do you want to learn how to make a car in Roblox Studio? Well, today I will be explaining the steps and process in making your very own car yourself. Also, if you're confused about any parts in the video or you're having something that's just not working for you, feel free to put your problem in the comments below and I'll try to help you solve it within 24 hours. With that said, let's move on to the first step. You're going to first start off by spawning in a part. Also make sure that your move and rotation settings are these so it's easier to align. Then you're going to size your part up a little bit. I like mine to be 13. And then you're going to go ahead and name this part your chassis. After you named it, you move it up by 1.5 studs and spawn in another part. You're going to go ahead and size this part by 1 by 1 by 3. Then go ahead and duplicate it and move it towards the corner and make sure it's centered with the car. After that, you're going to duplicate it and also duplicate it again and move it to the back. Your car will look something like this. And this step is optional, but I do recommend it, but coloring the different parts of your car so it's easier to differentiate them. Then you want to go to the model tab. In this model tab, you want to go and hit the down arrow and select a hinge constraint. With this hinge constraint, you want to hover over the center of the green as well as the red. Once you click those, you want to do the same to the opposite side. Then you want to make sure that the orange arrow is facing forward and the yellow arrow is facing upwards. Make sure that all of your hinges look like this. Then select your entire car and move it up for easier access. You want to do the same thing on the bottom side as well. Once you're done, select all the items and group it by hitting Ctrl-G. Then you want to name your parts. Because this is in the back and left section, you're going to put a capital B and a lowercase l and then name it wheel connector. Use the same concept to name the rest of your parts. Then you want to spawn in 4 cylinders and select all of them. You'll be setting the size to 1 by 4 by 4. Then take 2 of the wheels and center them to the green piece on both sides. Grabbing a hinge constraint again, select the center of the red block as well as the center of the wheel. Make sure the orange arrow is facing upwards and the yellow arrow is facing towards the wheel. Then move the attachment inside the wheel. Then move both of your wheels inside your model, as well as name them using the same concept from earlier. Now that you have your front, move both of the wheels towards the back for easier access later. Then insert a vehicle seat into your car and you can rotate it so that it's facing forward. You then follow closely as I put the car together. If you don't do this properly, your car will end up broken. Then you want to weld your vehicle seat to your chassis, as well as weld the front two wheel connectors to the chassis as well. When you hit play, your car should be welded and nothing should fall off except for the back part. Then create a folder inside your car. You want to name this folder Motors and Steering. Make sure it's named perfectly this, otherwise it won't work. Make sure it's named perfectly this, otherwise your code won't work. Make sure it's named perfectly this, otherwise your code isn't going to work. Then you want to select all your hinge constraints and move them. Then you want to select all your hinge constraints and move them into the folder. You're then going to name them by using the system from earlier, but after putting the first two letters, for example, front left, you're going to put 1 for the top and 2 for the bottom. If you're confused on this part, look closely in the screen as I'm doing it here. Then you want to select all your hinges and go over to the property. Then you want to select all your hinges, making sure that they are rotated Then select all your hinges and make sure they are rotated in the correct direction. Then go over to the property tab and with articulator type, set it to servo, as well as set these settings towards the respective numbers. After you've done that, these blue lines should show up. If you don't, go back and look at the. Afterwards, you should see these blue lines, and if you don't, go back and check your numbers again. Here we're going to start coding. If you don't want to look at me code all of this by myself, then you can go into the comments and the code is right there. Before you do, then you also want to make sure that your model is named car. Here I'm just scripting. Here I'm just defining. Here I'm starting to. At this point I'm starting to code the steering for the car. If you don't want to look at me and follow by myself, then you are free to look in the comments. If you don't want to type all of this yourself, I've pasted the. If you don't want to type all of this yourself, I've pasted the exact code inside the comments, as well as a description for it, telling you what it does. After coding, your car should be able to turn. If you have any error message, make sure to check your names as well as your code. Put the back wheels on the same way we did the front, making sure that the center and as well as the yellow arrow is facing upwards and the orange arrow is facing forward. The yellow arrow is pointing towards the wheel and the orange arrow is facing forward. Make sure to move your wheels inside the car model and as well, make sure to move your wheels inside the car model and name them. Then you're going to wheel them just like we did with the front. Then you want to move all your motors that you just made inside the folder and as well as name them with the respective system that I have established. As well as name them. Then go over to articulator type, select motor and set the max torque to 10,000. Go back to scripting, and again, if you don't want to watch me script, the full script is in the comments. Your car should now be able to drive as well as turn. If you like today's tutorial, then feel free to subscribe as well as leave a comment for any questions you still have.